Good morning, Catherine. Lovely to see you. I'm about to start the webinar and let everybody arrive.
Perfect. Nice to see you.
Catherine, good morning to you. It's lovely to see you. I am bang on 11 o'clock, so I've just opened the doors, opened the floodgates to allow everyone to come and join us this morning for our session. How are you this morning?
I'm well, thank you very much. The sun is shining and we're over the hump of
Beautiful.
the week and into Thursday.
It is a
Wonderful.
beautiful sunny spring day here as well. Absolutely lovely. So, a very good morning to you all. I can see you all logging in. We'll just give it maybe a minute or two to allow everyone to come in and get settled and join us for our interesting session this morning. I'm certainly looking forward to learning lots. So, thank you all for joining us. I can see you all starting to land in here as attendees, which is fantastic. Lots of interest in this session, lots of interest up and down the length and breadth of the UK from a real mixture of many HR professionals, a number of leaders across functions, across businesses of all different sectors. So really well represented today, and delighted everybody can join us as they have done. So we're at 11:01. There's loads to talk about and loads to get through. So if we don't mind, I'll get going. I guess the first thing to say is good morning to everybody. Thank you for making the time to join us today. For those that don't know me, my name is Barry Lee. I'm Director of Permanent Recruitment Solutions at Pertemps, based in Scotland, as the accent might have already given away to you. I'm really delighted this morning actually to be joined by Catherine Hume, who is founder of Evolution Partnering. Catherine is one of only 6 accredited menopause experts attached to the International Menopause Experts Group. So we really are in expert company this morning, and I'm really delighted that she has the time to bring this to our audience and our client base this morning. The reason we were keen to put this on the agenda as a topic for this webinar, which is the latest in a series of webinars we've been running and will continue to run as CPD sessions, is really, I suppose, a simple reality that menopause is no longer simply a wellbeing topic. It's now, firmly a workplace, legal and leadership issue. So this session, set in a bit of context, it really isn't about explaining menopause. You all are familiar with that. You know what it is, and many of you are dealing with it in your organisations already every day. What I wanted to focus on more was some of the broader themes of where are the real legal risks. What does good actually look like in practice in organisations, and how do you get ahead of what's coming and some of the changes from a legislative perspective without turning this into a tick box exercise? And what we're certainly seeing from a recruitment partner perspective is organisations that get this right, they aren't just avoiding claims, they're retaining experienced talent, they're improving manager capability, and they're building credibility with their workforce as well, which is really important. And those that don't are increasingly exposed. Before we launch in, if any of our attendees as we go today have questions, which I fully expect you to have, we really welcome those. Please could you use the chat function and put any questions in the chat, and we'll be able to pick them up at the back end here for you. Given the time and the unknown nature of how many questions we get, Catherine has very kindly offered to, after the session, we'll pick up any Q&A that we don't reach and cover before the end of this hour, and we'll put a bit of a Q&A document together, Catherine, and we'll issue that out to you all as a sort of post-webinar follow-up as well, along with a link to a newsletter that Catherine publishes on this very topic, which hopefully is helpful and useful for you. So, without further ado, Catherine, good morning. Thank you for being here today. I suppose the question I'd like to start with is, why menopause, Catherine?
There's always a motivator, isn't there? So, mine is a personal story. I'm not dissimilar to many people who experience perimenopause. In 2017, I developed some what I thought were one-off medical symptoms. So everything from random migraines that I'd never experienced to a frozen shoulder, basic forgetfulness and losing track mid-sentence, spinning lots of plates as a busy mum that worked full time. It just felt a bit off. I just didn't, something just wasn't right. I was employed by a healthcare brand at that point. I was on the road 5 days a week. I had chronic sleeping issues, and clearly driving every day. That wasn't great. My performance delivery from being a high achiever and multitasking fell off a cliff. As a result, my confidence and my capability to socially engage, I found myself withdrawing from things rather than having to manage and deal with those absent moments or losses of concentration mid-sentence. I had very recently lost my father-in-law just before with dementia, and I genuinely felt that I was actually beginning to go mad. I was losing my mind. I either had early onset dementia or did I have a brain tumor? That was the severity that the symptoms had in terms of my lifestyle.
Wow.
And as an ex blue chip company trainer, I just thought there has to be an easier way to access information about this. What I did find when I went down the rabbit hole of Google, which to someone else now might be ChatGPT,
Yeah.
Was just a whole lot of unverified, no substance information that predominantly I felt at best could be misleading, and at worst took me into a commercial world where people were selling goods and services to people who were suffering with chronic anxiety at 3 a.m., most of which I bought, incidentally, out of desperation.
Right.
And I just thought there has to be another way, that there has to be an easier way to find relatable, factual-based, evidence-backed information for organisations and for individuals. So that's why menopause. That's where I started.
So that, I mean, that's really interesting as a journey, and it sounds like it has been a journey. How did you go about amassing this knowledge from that position?
I think being a trainer and working in a corporate world, I was used to being able to access data. So I just went researching what was there out there rather than, using a Google. What businesses were out there already providing professional services to support women in my circumstances with proper factual information. And I found a business called Menopause Experts Group, and a lovely lady called Dee Murray. Now, Dee's the founder. It's very clinically read. Dee is here we go with the menopause memory, a psychologist and a psychotherapist. I did 30 hours of CPD accreditation with Menopause Experts Group, and I was approved as an accredited, and I'm also insured as a menopause consultant. And those were for personal learnings initially. They weren't for anything else.
Yeah.
You'd gone back to 20. By the time I found Dee, I think we were in 2021. I've recently been invited. I go back annually and I reaccredit and I retrain. And I was recently invited as one of currently 6 UK individuals within Menopause Experts Group to be part of an international round table. A pro group where we can debate on a monthly basis and have a look at new clinical evidence. We can talk about what's working well in other parts and other continents within the world. And it's fabulous because we can learn from lots of different people from lots of different sectors. I found myself that from that knowledge and those learnings, some lifestyle changes worked for me, improvements in diet, movement. For everyone on the call, magnesium is your friend. I'll probably touch on that again later. And just basic tweaks, lots of little changes made improvements for me, but all of these were coping strategies that I learned during that accreditation with Menopause Experts Group. I then, at that point, went on to HRT, which in itself was another minefield. It took me 4 attempts to find a version of HRT that worked well for my body. Ultimately, I left employment, Barry. I did that learning with Menopause Experts Group. I left full-time employment. And to be fair to the people in that business, there was no policy for menopause. They had no data. And at that point, in a wider, broad spectrum for the benefit of all of the HR people on the call, there were only 2 listed employment tribunals that had ever quoted menopause within.
Wow, is that right?
So that you're going back a long time. The world has moved on as much as we think possibly It hasn't. It absolutely has.
Yep.
And those managers in HR functions did what they should do. They followed policy, they followed process. They had no personal experience of menopause. So they had very limited knowledge of the implications or the impact on someone's life. So they followed the framework they had. I've subsequently, since then, been self-employed. I operate now in the consultancy world. And for the last 3 years, I've been providing fractional HR directors into scaling businesses. And now I deliver a full C-suite service into those scaling businesses. So there is life beyond menopause. And I just grasped it with open arms and decided I would do something different with it and behave in a different way. I think 9 years deep personal experience of menopause, as well as the training and coaching. And I think 3 years of study and licensed accreditation. Putting those learnings into practice just seemed like a natural transition when I'm already dealing with businesses every day.
Yeah.
So now I deliver one-to-one to groups, workplaces, boards, and I refresh that training annually. And now I get to work with lots of businesses in that menopause space.
It might be appropriate to say at this stage, as the male in the room, I happen to know, and I pass this feedback on to you, I happen to know an almost all, or certainly predominantly male, senior exec board of an organisation who are a client of ours that you did some work with at that level, which was transformational for them on this very topic. So,
and all male groups always fabulous.
Yeah, it's fantastic that you're bringing this level of lived experience, and even some of the comments actually popping through in the chat already. There are people saying your story sounds so familiar to mine. Yeah, really relatable.
That happens often.
We touched on Google. We Google it or we chat GPT it nowadays. Maybe the modern equivalent to Google. And again, I think everybody's probably relating and nodding away in the background about that. Taking it into the workplace and the work that you do and the organisations that you engage with. Give us an indication, what is the size and scale of this within the workplace or the world of work, Catherine?
So I like my numbers, Barry, so we've got some numbers.
Okay.
So in the UK, there are currently midlife women. We've got 15.5 million of us. Not a small number.
Not an inconsiderable number.
7 million of which are still within the workplace in some format or another. And interestingly, 8.5 million are economically, not participating. Now you have to ask yourself why. There's more information and data that needs done there. 67% of people, just like me and just like the people on your call, report that their symptoms impact them predominantly more so in the workplace because it's much more of a pressured environment than being at home. It's easier to cope with at home when it's family and friends and people who know and love you. When you're in the workplace and you've got a professional facade to maintain, it's very difficult to admit that you're struggling.
There's a vulnerability there, isn't there?
Yeah, especially when people know you as a strong person that multitasks, an overachiever. There's something very difficult about that. 1 in 6 women, Barry, consider leaving the workforce. I'm one of them.
That's extraordinary numbers from a...
1 in 4 go on to exit completely, like I did.
Wow.
So 25% of senior people with decades of experience under their belt just choose to leave. What an opportunity for us to retain talent and experience and all of that knowledge bank that literally just walks out the door. And often they don't say it's linked to symptoms of menopause. They just disengage. It's
a quiet, exit door.
82% of those, and this is from a CIPD study, so that this data is all available. 82% say if they'd felt supported in the workplace, they would have stayed.
That's a staggering
That puts the onus
impact
on us and the employers to do something positive to engage with this volume number of people. And the workplace is a better place with a higher percentage of women within it. 10% of those people, and this is a scary fact, say that they felt discriminated against.
That's a high number of people.
That's a huge red flag and a massive risk to every potential employer. So there's some numbers. Does that put it into context? Or?
Goodness me. I mean, it certainly does. So what do you see this washing through as in terms of I suppose that impact at work. What does it look like when you see it and experience it, and what's reported, and what do you find out?
With the benefit of hindsight, and typically it's always in hindsight, but line managers are usually the first people to notice small changes, and it's small changes in behaviour or small changes in character. It's not some overwhelming. There's never an announcement of "I'm perimenopause."
Yes.
It's little things like unusual lateness, someone whose reliability just changes,
Okay.
someone who's much more emotional than normal. Maybe it's an outburst, or maybe it's tears that typically haven't been seen at work. Mood swings where someone, comes into work, bounces in the door, and by lunchtime is in a grim frame of mind. Irritability, little things that are just irking away at someone. That's probably a good Scottish word for everyone else.
Yes.
Forgetfulness is the big one. Things that you would normally have just retrieved from your back of your mind and used suddenly are no longer accessible, and you start to forget really simple things like people's names, like data that you would have rhymed off, things you've known for 20 and 30 years that just suddenly the information recalled just isn't there. That cognitive functionality just isn't there.
That brain fog thing, would that be relatable to that? Because again, we're having a number of comments coming through about that and how that manifests in the workplace.
It's something that initially you try to just kind of ignore, process, deal with, get on with, but actually it's worth talking about. And to sum it up just as brain fog, when you're midway through that, is actually, it's not an adequate description to describe how that feels, because it creates a bit of a panic internally. I mean, I'll give you an example, Barry. I've still got notes in front of me today. Now, normally I could have ad-libbed all of this. I've still got some notes in case my memory prompt drops and I need a backup. Now, I'd never have done that before.
So that's a tangible change that you have made.
And it's a default now. I always make sure I've got some prep done. I always make sure going into any environment that I've got some backup just in case, so that I've got a word or a phrase or a sentence to put me back on track again.
Okay.
I think concentration levels is a big one. Someone who's happily worked away before, concentration levels just drop. They don't have that same capability to focus for long periods of time. And the disengagement, the stepping back, the choosing not to socially interact with people can be a big thing, because there's quite a lot of overwhelm in menopause. And sometimes you just need to retract and pull yourself back from some of that. So that's the kinds of behaviours and the sorts of things that I would say line managers typically will notice before anyone else.
That you're spotting. And I guess it was really interesting to hear of the suite of those things, because those individuals, some of those in isolation might be just put down to, I mean, we're having a number of comments coming through around procrastination of tasks, feeling like there's too much to do, too much to think about, so people put it off. Having to find words to describe a word you can't remember is so frustrating, and is one of the things I think make me feel, old. So again, back to what you said 5 minutes ago around questioning your own cognitive, balance and stability. What
you'll probably find is the people who've made these comments are people who've previously spun lots of plates, led busy lives, are used to multitasking and juggling, and we take it much more. It's more difficult and more hard to process when you've been so used to having a lifetime habit of just multitasking. It's almost an admission of feeling as if you're failing.
Right. So loads of questions pouring through around this particular bit from a manager perspective. Yeah. So, recognising symptoms, and we'll come back to,
and we will cover
these.
That. We'll hopefully during the call.
What's the cost of this in the workplace?
Oh, I think there are tangible pound note costs, and then there are hidden costs that we probably don't equate to. So I think that the big obvious one is the replacement costs for recruitment, for everything from onboarding to lost productivity to that knowledge loss that we mentioned earlier. You're losing highly experienced people that know your industry, your sector, your product or service inside out, and you're replacing them probably with someone who doesn't have those decades of experience. I think absence in the UK linked to menopause is £191 million.
Wow.
It's huge cost.
Enormous.
There's an average per person. There's typically annually an average of 7 days sick leave per year.
Okay.
For a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
And the one that absolutely scares me the most is that presenteeism or drawback or pullback in performance, that impaired performance because of the cognitive issues. There's 100 billion loss in UK productivity caused by that impact in the workplace. I think the one that you can't necessarily put a measure on in terms of pound notes is the career stagnation. So people who don't want to step further up the rung for fear that this is going to hold them back. I think the hole that creates in succession planning for HR teams and businesses. And then there's the organisational loss of people just choosing to exit. And they typically exit quietly. They're not making a fuss about why they're leaving. They just exit quietly. Yes. And then if you look at a leadership pipeline, you often businesses have already got someone earmarked as, a progression. So that suddenly they have gaps in attrition and gaps in that leadership pipeline as well.
So I was just thinking about the impact on your current and future leadership pipeline as you were speaking there, as somebody who recruits a lot of leaders of different functions into different organisations in what we do, and that aspect of diversity, gender balance in senior leadership teams is being massively impacted at this stage. Yeah. Because if these people are exiting the workplace or their circumstances are changing, they're never getting to that opportunity to then be
absolutely
to the glass ceiling, isn't it?
It creates a hole in that female representation at board without a shadow of a doubt, and it's not been vocalised, it's not been talked about. We've got, we're trying to do things about gender pay gap, and we're trying to do things about, DE&I in terms of board, but actually the problem is very visible and very obvious. We just need to tackle it head on and look at strategies and ways that businesses can support women to stay within the workplace. Sure. I think the other thing to think about is externally. So what's the perception of your brand? If I'm looking at your organisation with a view to joining and with a view to looking at how does your business behave? Is there a fit for me in that business? What's your employer brand attraction? Because, if businesses see strong menopause, women looking at those businesses will be attracted to the fact that business has a culture of behaving in a certain way and being supportive and providing that additional help through to support in those stages, even if they're not yet perimenopause or menopause. Younger women now are thinking ahead about the types of brands.
Into this as an issue. And I think. Sorry, I was going to say, I guess that I know there's a lot of HR professionals on this call who are passionate about driving that as an engine, as a vehicle within their organisation. So we'll talk about that.
Every business has limitations, Barry. Everyone's well aware of that. But it's not always about budget. It's not always about how much you spend on this.
Okay.
But I think how businesses choose to respond now most certainly can help to dictate the outcomes and the direct impact menopause has in the lives of midlife women within their organisation.
You've maybe touched on some of them there, but what do you see as the risks? What are the risks to businesses where they're not doing that?
I think from a legal standpoint, I think that the risks are you've got a new Employment Rights Act, and it very firmly it is focused on moving forward, looking at menopause for larger businesses and menopause action plans. But I think the legal risk, if you were to get to a situation of employment tribunal, is predominantly around sex discrimination, age discrimination, and fairly often disability discrimination, because long-term impacts clearly, if they're going to be sustained, which they are, perimenopause can last up to 15 years.
I don't know that. Wow.
But you have to be able to think of the fact that if someone's going to have impaired cognitive behaviour, if they're going to have sustained debilitating health issues, that will be classed under Disability Act. So poor handling of menopause issues within the workplace, actually, they can have a massive impact on the increase in grievances within a business and the number of potential employment tribunals. And I think that the underlying hidden one is reputational damage. No one wants their brand or their reputation damaged by a line manager mishandling an opportunity to properly process an issue linked to menopause. And employment tribunals every year we're seeing enormous jumps in the number of cases that go to employment tribunal that are now quoting menopause within them. So there is financial risk in terms of board thinking about how do we properly manage this and what are we doing as an organisation about it.
And I think that leader, just thinking what you're saying there about the perimenopause could last 15 years potentially. If you substituted the word menopause for an employee experiencing a cancer diagnosis, the way we contextually think about wrapping our arms around that individual as an organisation might be quite different, and yet the implications and the effects of it can there's lots of parallels there.
Yeah, the one I compare it to, Barry, if I'm in a workplace, typically is their mental health offering. Yep. Because we've gone through that wave and we've trained lots of people as mental health first aiders in the workplace. And this is just another example of something very similar.
Right.
And pretty much a lot of what you do there is transferable over. So we're not reinventing the wheel here. A lot of businesses are already doing some of this and doing it really well.
Applying best practice. What's changed to bring this so into focus then?
So there's lots of noise just now around menopause, and I'm very well aware of that. Some of it's fabulous and some of it's not so great. There's a lot of commercialism around it. But it's very much around the Employment Rights Act from November 2025, where voluntary already, and this is live from the beginning of this month, is creating menopause action plans in the workplace and policy in the workplace, and it's voluntary in 2026. For businesses of 250 plus employees or more, this is mandatory from March 2027.
Wow, yeah.
So we've almost got a period of grace to get fit for legislation. This doesn't, it's not a let's wait till April next year and decide how we're tackling this. There's a period of time for people to gradually introduce where and when they've got the opportunity to, and to create a pathway so that there's a framework to underpin and support this as we move forward. And it's often now so much more linked to the gender pay gap that big businesses of 250 plus are already mandatory having to report. And the reason it's so linked to that is a lot of the data you already have if you're producing gender pay gap reports is you're looking at analysis, you've probably already got an understanding of what impacts mid-career, how many of your employees fall into that category. You've probably already got data that actually, if the right reports were pulled and that data was captured and analysed, I think that would show a way and it would give a very clear path for HR leaders to be able to present a proposition to a business that says, in support of this. The menopause action plans are going to be uploaded to the government portal in exactly the same way that the gender pay gap information is. So there's a real intrinsic link between the two. And you said at the very beginning, there's a massive shift. This isn't just a personal healthcare issue now, it's very much a wellbeing issue. And I think it's time for a bit of critical thinking and decision making for business around that, to be able to look at how can they support and what can they do, what's within the realms of being able to help as they do that. I think they've got access to things like absent patterns. So whatever HRIS system we're using, there'll be absent patterns. There'll be retention information for different brackets, male, female, age groups, the length of service of leavers exiting a business. There'll be employee survey data. And again, all of these things can capture data that could be really helpful. Are they comfortable to discuss this openly? It's really easy for most employee surveys for you to actually have conversations about it, or in exit interviews to be just ascertaining all of those facts so that you've got more data to support how your plan should look for your business moving forward.
where does the liability and the risk sit?
Great question. And I can see the HR people all smiling because they know exactly what I'm going to say. The liability predominantly always comes from inconsistency in managers' or leaders' behaviours. Because if you treat one individual one way and then treat another individual a different way, we set ourselves up to be creating risk and potential discrimination. So I always say in any business that the managers and the leaders and the boards in businesses, and I'll come back to that because I think they're critical, you can choose to be your biggest risk, or they can choose to be your biggest differentiator. You know better than me, Barry. Most people don't exit a business, they exit from a manager that they don't like reporting into.
Very often there's an issue there, yeah.
So I think it's I always start with board, and I suppose it's my differentiator. Every day I talk with board members, every day I'm talking about fractional C-suite services with board. So I find it very easy to have these conversations. In my personal situation, if the boards don't want to engage in menopause and they don't want to be part of the process or rollout within a business, I will happily introduce them to someone else, but I would choose not to work with them. Now, that's for me about integrity. I don't want box ticking. I don't want greenwashing. I want the board engaged, and it's really important because they create the mood, they create the vibe, they give everyone else permission to have these conversations. And if they behave that way, then the rest of the organisation, it normalises it, it creates that open forum. And they hold the capability and the authority to make sure the rest of the business buys into that by giving permissions. And you're creating an entire organisation then that's a culture, that you create that safety and that psychological safe space for women to feel that they can talk about menopause openly and they can be transparent about how they feel or how it's affecting them in the workplace. And I'll be really honest, I think without starting with board and leadership, it's a policy on a shared drive.
So I've had a really, really interesting question that I'm going to dip into on exactly this topic, very timely come through on the chat there. And I don't expect you to, answer this directly, Catherine, but in general terms, because I think what you're alluding to there is if it doesn't start at the top, it's a real challenge for the HR practitioners that are on the call or leaders. So we have a guest today who's talked about their organisation is relatively small with around 50 employees. They have a mixed gender senior leadership team. The COO is a woman who speaks openly about being menopausal. Whilst this visibility can be seen as a positive, having a senior leader who understands the lived experience of menopause, her personal stance is that she simply gets on with her workload and therefore questions why others might need additional consideration. And this is creating a tension for a smaller organisation like theirs, where leadership perspectives can strongly influence culture. Framing menopause primarily as a matter of individual resilience risks overlooking the wide range of experiences and challenges that people face. This individual would like to explore how to help shift the narrative so that menopause is recognised not just as an individual issue, but as something the organisation should address more proactively, proportionately and inclusively. And I suspect that's very relatable to a lot of people.
And not uncommon. A lot of the businesses I work with aren't huge multinational corporates. It comes up often, and typically it's interesting that it's actually a woman who's saying just get on with it. I've come across this a few times, and I always try and give people a comparison or something to think about that allows them the opportunity to change their view or to consider that other people might be different. And what I do is I go back to the entire menstrual cycle and I'll say to them, so if we go back in time to the point in time in life, we all had different every time of the month. Some of us would have a really hard time. Some of us just sailed through the menstrual cycle without any issues. Then we hit pregnancy, and some of us had horrid pregnancies and easy deliveries, and some of us had wonderful pregnancies and easy deliveries. And I compare it to that because we're all individual. Our biology is completely different. And some other conditions impact how severe menopause can be. So, for example, if someone's ADHD, if someone has suffered with endometriosis, there are what I call exaggerators. So without knowing the specific individuals, we could be comparing apples to pears. So every journey is different, and businesses have to understand that. And it's part of all of the training workshop sessions I do with leaders, with menopause champions, or with board. I openly talk about the impact and the variations of how one woman. I mean, someone said to me recently, I don't remember my mother going on about menopause quite so much. And I said to her, this isn't your mother's menopause.
Okay.
Because environmentally, if you look at our lifestyles, we as women have probably all at some point or another been on birth control. Our mothers didn't do that.
So generationally and societally, and
if you look at environmental, we have a lifetime of, whether we like to talk it or not, and there's a horrid documentary about this, and the impact of plastics in biologically in our bodies. Our mothers didn't eat pre-packed foods with plastic. They didn't drink bottled water. There are other factors that impact us now that weren't there 50 years ago. So I think it has to be taken with there are variations and extremes of how people.
It's not a one size fits all experience that person A has experienced menopause, person B has, and coping mechanisms are different. I just want to pick you up on, you mentioned exaggerators there. And you mentioned ADHD as one. For those, there might be people on this call that were on a webinar we hosted a few months ago around neurodiversity in the workplace. So that, again, is new information to me, that in a world where we're becoming more familiar and aware and inclusive and alive to neurodiversity in the world and what that looks like from a workplace perspective, that also is can be an influencing factor.
Absolutely. And I think if I use my example of personal example, so just as I thought I'd got menopause under control and symptoms under control, my endocrine system decided it would join the party, and I took an autoimmune disorder which creates an overactive thyroid. An overactive thyroid and menopause together is a bit like a time bomb. It's not particularly helpful.
Right.
So, and again, that meant I've got to reevaluate everything. I'm having to reevaluate lifestyle choices, timings of things, what I take, what I don't take, what I'll avoid when I'm choosing to sleep and rest. Right. All of these things now need reevaluated because the level of fatigue that added into the menopause mix wasn't particularly helpful, and endocrine was not invited to join the party.
So that was another unexpected development. So you're talking a bit around there, your own, for want of a better expression, personal management plan for you. And we talked about a few minutes ago the liability and the risk sitting with organisations. What is your best advice to those on the call today as to how to negate that?
I think every business is different, and I always say to a business, let's look at your business and your culture and your values and start there. Because when you better understand the business you're working with and the dynamics of that business and the culture within that business, it gives you a better place to start. So I always start with policy. Do you have a menopause policy? And lots don't. Let's look at what that should look like, and look at the tone that's written in. And I always try and get marketing involved in this because they will say our brand tone of voice is A, B, or C. And I always ask people to compare, if they have a menopause policy, compare it and have a look at how does that measure up and how is the language and the tonality of that versus, for example, your maternity or paternity policy or your mental health policy. Because they should be written in an empathetic manner. It should be seen as a supportive document rather than, just cold, hard facts.
Yeah.
And simple things within menopause policies. So some businesses choose to report absence through menopause in a different way to the sickness absence, so that they're not then managing huge absence issues that are linked to something that potentially has sex, age, or discrimination against it. So there's lots that you can do, but it's about having an action plan that you're comfortable with as a business, that you're happy to back, and then turning that into deliverable actions. There's no point in it just sitting in a shared drive and on week one, when you join a business, you read it. It has to be a lived thing that you're prepared to support and engage with as ongoing. And I think that policy and roll out a policy to teams and to managers is start with board, get them to sign off on policy and agree to the content, then look at your leadership and your management teams. Have we trained all of them on it? The most valuable sessions I deliver are manager sessions, not sessions to people suffering from the symptoms of menopause.
A lot of questions around managers and support managers. One of them around sort of menopause policy was, are you able to, separate to this, potentially provide templates or guidance on menopause action plans and menopause policy?
Absolutely. Typically what I don't do is hand over a standard policy, because I never quite think it's fit for purpose. I would rather engage with a business and look at, what have they got already in terms of contract, handbook, policies, and make sure that sort of company values is built in to something. So it's better to be tailor-made. I'm sure there are lots of templates out there. I've seen some really good policies, and I've seen some really dreadful single-page, bullet point, ice cold policies that don't serve the purpose in which they were hoped to be designed. The other thing that really helps in the workplace is having trained menopause champions. So if you imagine us as a workplace relationship and you're my boss, I don't know if everyone would be as comfortable as me having a conversation about menopause with a male manager.
Sure, yeah.
And sometimes, because it's your line manager and there's that reporting structure and that hierarchy in an organisation, actually, maybe I'd prefer to just talk to another menopause champion. So someone who's trained, someone who's accredited, who's CPD, qualified, and who can come on a quarterly basis to workshops, who can dip into some champion resources, and therefore has a very different level of knowledge and understanding of how menopause impacts people. And I think that supports a manager. I think that takes some of the pressure off of a line manager.
Absolutely. A number of the points we've got here is around how do we support managers, managers that are nervous or lack skill and knowledge or capability around this. And actually, I would imagine this is something managers would welcome in a lot of organisations where, it's... and I suppose going back to what we were talking earlier about, if I'm employed in an organisation and I'm experiencing this and I have the vehicle for, a menopause champion or somebody that I can go and access and engage with, that in itself is likely, you would think, to increase retention and avoid some of those things we talked about earlier.
Absolutely.
Is there a way to approach all of this that you've seen works best, Catherine?
In my experience, how you choose to train line managers in a business is the key to success with it. And again, everyone that's HR related on the call will be smiling, because those conversations can be practiced. They can be done in a way that is professional and achieves the aims and ambitions of the business, as well as supporting people suffering from menopause symptoms. And I would say in any HR organisation, is look at the framework for that. Creating a manager training programme that sits managers down is absolutely critical to having a successful launch of that policy and then having people go through that process. And it's really simple language. Make it really easy to understand. So, I've got 5 steps that I put into training for managers, and it's that opening line. What are they going to say to that person when they first sit down to have the conversation? And it's a really simple opening statement. So it's something like, I've noticed, and then whatever the issue is that they've noticed. And then the sitting back and listening and having given that employee time to talk. Let the employee lead the conversation. And that sounds quite counterintuitive for a manager. But the reason I say let them lead will become apparent. Explore it. So asking questions like, what would help? How can we support? Agreeing any practical or realistic adjustments that need done. And I say agree We're not passing adjustments onto an employee as this is what we've chosen as a company to do for you. It's an agreed, what would you need? What do you think would help? And then you're just supporting that. So it's an agreement. And then a simple review and checking in regularly. Is that working or is that helping? Just keeping it simple. So a 5-step: open, listen, explore, ask some questions, agree, and review. Just a really simple framework. And I always laugh with managers. I'll get them to role play and talk about what's the language, what's the tonality that they're using, what sort of levels of sensitivity or empathy or support are they illustrating? Because it's quite easy to have quite a cold clinical conversation that's just questions, but it's how they then engage in removing any doubt or any tension from the situation. I think staying neutral and professional is really important for managers particularly. It's very easy to get caught up in the clinical or medical piece, and that's not their remit. Their remit is to help the individual and help the workplace, and focus on the impact at work, not symptoms necessarily that impact their life out with work. Their primary consideration is the impact of menopause at work.
So that's an interesting paradigm, isn't it? The at work thing, because you think of it, or I do, probably as it's a personal condition. It's a condition of being a human being. But we're talking focused on workplace and what that looks like in that space.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's really important for managers is 2 things. One, any conversations about menopause are absolutely firmly confidential.
Okay.
Because of the level of risk for a business. And the second one is the documentation. So I'm not expecting them to write a formal follow-up letter or email, but they should be very likely and not clinically. We had a conversation, this is what we chatted about, this is what you felt you wanted, this is what we thought we could do to help. So it is documented, but in a very warm, supportive, empathetic manner. And managers' biggest mistakes, Barry, are always the same thing. They try to diagnose the problem and dive straight into diagnosis.
Right.
Or they try to solve the problem for the person and then they feel they're being put upon with solutions.
Okay.
Or worse still, they know there's a problem and they just choose to avoid the problem. That's
ignore.
Feels marginalised then. So that's part of the things I cover in a manager workshop. Yeah.
I really like the structure of that. I think a lot of what you've talked about there, I suppose, is a toolkit for managers. That there's a lot of managers I know who would probably say that doesn't sound like an easy conversation, Catherine.
I think it can be an easy conversation. I think the thought of doing it before you begin to it, and I think it's having a script, and I don't mean a verbatim word by word, but have a structure, that simple HR framework of what does that dialogue look like, that 5-step process I mentioned, and just bullet points, some little opening things that you might say to lead you through that process. So if I give you an example, I've noticed that you might not be yourself lately. Is everything okay? That's just a really simple opening question. There's no accusation, there's no assumption, that there's no question that the person feels you're questioning their capability either.
Sure.
Is there anything we can support you with?
Okay.
It's just an easy, let the person come to you and tell you that this is perimenopause or menopause. I think being observational is really helpful because you can say, I've noticed, I've seen. It's an easier door opener, and you're not being assumptive then, that there's no accusational statements being made. I think it opens the door without forcing disclosure. Does that make sense?
It creates a platform of safe space for people to.
And that person then, the conversation then carries on in what I would call a permission-based way, because that person's allowing you in to have that dialogue. You've not raised it as a topic.
Sure.
They're doing that. So you can then openly explore support because it's done in the right way. I think the what not to say is often more important than the what to say.
Okay.
The comment that someone popped up earlier in terms of saying that someone else had said, well, everyone goes through it, just get on with it.
Yeah.
I hear that often. And I think that's not great. And what it illustrates in terms of risk to a business is discrimination and instant loss of trust. No one in that organisation will ever trust that person with a menopause conversation. They've just isolated themselves in the party. I think not to be overly personal or intrusive, which is difficult if you already have been working with someone for 10 years and you've got a really good open relationship. Not to pry, so not to ask what symptoms is it that you're having, or that probing for clinical information isn't really necessary in the workplace unless that person, permission-based, is volunteering the information, because it's a breach of privacy.
So that's a really fine line, isn't it?
Yeah, there is. And there's also that intrusive feeling for the person. So inappropriate questioning is a risk to the business, again, in terms of potential follow-up later. How this is handled is really important. I've got a live issue at the moment with a business, and one of the directors has come to me quietly to say, we've got this problem, there's been a grievance raised, this isn't looking like it's going to end well.
Okay.
And I've had them speak with one of the fractional HR directors to look at ways of how we can kind of take the tension out of that situation, and how we can take all the sort of calm approach to put oil over troubled waters and deal with that as a bigger problem, because that will result in that person potentially exiting that business and filing for discrimination within an employment tribunal. So I think it's and don't use assumptive statements. You know, when we went through what the manager had actually said to that individual, excuse me, I need to get some water.
Sure thing.
There were some assumptive statements in amongst it.
Okay.
So I think you're suffering from menopause.
Okay.
Was what a manager said. So again, it can be taken as slightly offensive or far too probing. And I think it's just thinking potentially about that discrimination element and not using things like words and sayings like that. Making reference to performance. So your performance has dropped, you need to fix it. Those kinds of statements, whilst HR will say, well, no one would ever say that, they absolutely do.
Okay.
And I think it's linking it to support, not blame. I think these are, I think in life we're all really fast to jump on what's the fix. How do we fix this? And jumping straight to solutions without listening first often is where the trust and the breakdown of relationship piece happens. So I think that open dialogue and the asking open questions is critical.
Seeking to understand. What, on that note then, and I think we've got you've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, what support and help is there to make these efforts a success?
Good question. There's a lot of support. Most businesses, regardless of scale or size, can have access to occupational health services through a third party. If you're a member of a Chambers of Commerce, then potentially even as a small business, you'll have access to a preferred supplier in terms of occupational health. That would allow for a clinical viewpoint that would allow the business to have more accurate information. So you've got all of the personal information from a person, and then an occupational health report might help with some clinical evidence. So you're defaulting the clinical dialogue to someone who's trained and expert in that field.
Okay.
I think you've got lots of people like me who deliver training and workshops and consultation within the workplace. So whether that's one-to-one for employees, so I'll often do an hour session with an individual employee who's been referred to me by their employer. The employer picks up the bill for that, and that person gets an hour time to go through just a clarity session of what are they experiencing, how are they feeling. And I use a document that I created that's a bit like a menopause symptom checker, but it's done in a very conversational style. And the person completes that as we go through. And then at the very end of that hour's conversation, there's a clinical paragraph at the end of that document. And that's for them to take with them when they go for a GP appointment. to help the GP join the dots. If you ever go through any of my training sessions, you'll hear me say join the dots frequently. With hindsight, if I go back to my early symptoms of frozen shoulder, migraines, there were lots of telltale signs that I didn't know back then. But now, if you've got a symptom checker and you're able to go through, you actually really quickly join the dots and get to that. This is perimenopause really, really quickly. So a clinician, you know yourself, if you go to a GP, you've probably got 10 minutes max.
Yep.
They're under pressure. They typically deal with one symptom at a time. So diagnosing menopause isn't an easy fix. If they go in with this document completed, then what happens is the GP quickly looks at all of the tick boxes and the severity of the symptoms. Then they read the clinician's paragraph, and very quickly you'll be in a position to diagnose and say, yeah, I would agree, I suspect you are now perimenopause. So you're helping people to learn. It's an educational hour. It's not anything more than that. And you're building their confidence. I know lots of women who've gone to a GP appointment, spontaneously combust into floods of tears, not being able to articulate themselves. Their brain has gone blank. Their brain and tongue won't align to get the message across to a GP. That document removes all of that fear and just gives them that confidence to be able to really go in with a power of knowledge and education behind them to help. And I think even for a business, if someone can go through that checker and then say, yeah, you're right, I think I might be perimenopause, that puts the business in a great place to be able to say, right, let's see what we can do to help. What actions do we have to take to support you in that? Just as a fact, Barry, and I'm sure you're not going to believe this, but typically it takes 7 GP visits in the UK to be diagnosed as perimenopausal.
That's extraordinary. I can only imagine the length of time that is stretched over. As you've said that, we've had a comment from someone in the chat here saying I'm 42 and undergoing tests for perimenopause. They've said if I'm under 45, it's very difficult to diagnose as our hormones fluctuate. So this is...
I think if they want to diagnose via blood test, then you need the blood test taken at 3 points in your cycle.
Right.
No GP practice wants to do that. If you go in with a symptom checker completed and you've got all the boxes ticked and the severity ticked, the GP will have a very, very different view. I've had GPs ring me and say, can we have the template for your symptom checker so that we can just give it to people?
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
It's literally really easy to do. Symptom checker, there's nothing complex about it. And I break it into medical terms, so what cognitive disorders are going on, so that it's very easy for a clinician especially to complete and to fill in. But I think that's how much, and GPs aren't specialists in menopause. To be fair to most of them, they will have completed their degree and done their practice and gone into a GP's business without ever really doing any detail in menopause.
A couple of comments here on that saying GPs have had no training on this, which would chime with what you're saying. A number of questions coming through. I'm conscious we've got 2 minutes left, and I don't want to keep everybody longer, although I'm sure there'll be an appetite for more. How else can employers and HR support employees and managers from here?
I think it's looking at what reasonable adjustments are reasonable to that business. They have to be both fit for the organisation and fit for the person suffering from the symptoms. It's not a reasonable adjustment, as an example, for a teacher to say, I'm going to work from home. That's clearly not suitable for that particular organisation.
Yep.
So it's looking at what flexibility can a business have. So can you flex on start times and finish times to accommodate for the fact that maybe someone's not slept well? Can you offer more regular breaks if they're required for concentration, or for someone to be able to just step outside and cool down and grab some cold water? Is there water available in that environment? Is there ventilation available within that environment? Is there any opportunity to temporarily adjust workload? Sometimes just adjusting the workload for a short period of time can help. If remote or hybrid working is an option, is there slightly more flexibility can be given over that time span for that individual? And the one thing that I often say is, do you have some quiet space? Is there somewhere someone can go just to get a little bit of quiet time? Because when you get overwhelmed, and you get yourself into a pickle and you're a bit too hot and your brain's fried, it's really nice to have somewhere quiet to go just to settle down. But they have to be individual and they have to be agreed between the employee and the line manager.
Lots and lots to think about. We're coming to the end of our time together, unfortunately. Thank you. We've got a number of comments and questions that are excellent in the chat here. What I'm going to suggest we do, Catherine, is, and you've very kindly offered this already, is pick all of these up and come back with some information and advice and helpful guidance on it. We'll put that in a Q&A sheet that will circulate to everybody who's registered for this session, whether they've been able to attend or not on the day. I had a few people this morning, obviously, with other things coming up, that messaged me. We'll circulate that along with a recording of this, perhaps. And on top of that, I think what we'll also do is put in a link to your newsletter and further contact information for you, for people that can do that. A couple of questions and points here around, developing more. So if there's an appetite for maybe a further follow-up session with the same audience, or any other questions or anything, we'll look at putting that together if there's an appetite for it. But thank you so much for today. Really, really insightful. Really, I've absolutely learned lots and found it very useful. I really hope that our audience on the call today have found it a useful investment of their time and taking something away, because I appreciate everybody is really busy. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll look forward to catching up hopefully with you all again very soon. Thanks so much.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Bye bye.